much more of a, I guess, a moderate attempt at peace negotiations. And the little part over there by that's Gaza, right?
It's totally encircled, where they cannot go to a port and run away from shelling. They cannot go, of course, into Israel because they are totally under siege, and they cannot
cross into Egypt.
Of course not. That's the whole issue, and that's the whole turmoil in the Arab world, and the whole pressure on Egypt is to open something called the Rafah Ma'bar Rafah, or the crossing. And the aid that the lady is talking about is trickling inside, but extremely, I mean, you have 1.5 million people, like the professor here said, have been under siege for years. How 50 trucks or 500 trucks are going to give you medicine for diabetic people, for patients, for surgeries? You have more than 3,000 Palestinians who have amazing injuries. The hospitals are depleted. It's a humanitarian crisis. And these people, when they are dying or they're grieving or they're praying, thanks to the lady offering them all this spirituality, really, they're not thinking Hamas, they're not thinking politics, they're thinking survival, and they are encircled, almost like the Vatican yesterday came out and said it's a concentration camp.
Okay, what do you want to say about this, Jonathan?
You know, one of the problems you're dealing with, and one of the, you know, as I think she mentioned on the air, that Israel is having probably its primary problem with, is that its own humanities preventing it from doing what it needs to do in order to stop the rockets from being fired, because you're having situations where Israel is going out of its way the best it can to prevent civilian casualties. It's launching planes that drop leaflets over areas going, these are the areas along the Philadelphia corridor, which is that area between Gaza and Egypt, where you wind up having the tunnels where the arms are coming in. So you notify those residents that that this is going to be attacked. You also have cell phone calls being made to areas that are going to be hit prior to the bombings taking place, and then you have Hamas bringing in civilians, or trying to get civilians to use, their own citizens, willing or not willing.
1.5 million people in a city that is double the size of Washington, D.C., so you are doomed to kill civilians no matter what.
Let's Dr. Smith in here. Go ahead,
just to clarify, I mean, essentially, the question is, and the laws of war say you have to be discriminate both in your sort of choice of munitions and in the tactics that you use. And discrimination means to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. You also have to be proportional in your response. And Hamas clearly was not discriminate. The weapons it's been using, many of which are basically rather crude, homemade weapons, which whatever Israel does, they should be able to resume production of those pretty quickly. Hamas has clearly not been discriminate, and they've just targeted civilian areas in southern Israel. But Israel, at the same time, Israel has used tactics which, as Summer is saying, tactics which in the close conditions of Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world, are inevitably going to kill significant numbers of civilians. And just the response now that it's sort of street fighting and using pretty heavy artillery from tanks, the numbers are likely to go up. And so what we're looking, the big picture now is there's sort of this race going on between the Israelis to accomplish what they have set out to accomplish, and sort of rising world opinion against the methods that the Israelis are using.
And the proportion of it. Okay, let's take a break. I know you want to speak. We have Jim via email. We want to get him in here, and we'll take a break and be right back. Okay, Jim via email about this Middle East situation in Gaza says Hamas has fired 100 rockets into Israel without a response from them. Hamas does not want peace. They have said that what they want is for Israel to not exist. I think the attacks by Israel designed to change behavior are totally appropriate. Discuss.
Actually, I want to come back to John. He made a very good point, I think, many good points, but really we have to remember there was a ceasefire. Israel sat and negotiated, maybe not necessarily immediately with Hamas, but with the representative, and they had a ceasefire, and Israel broke it 195 times, and I know that Hamas also broke it. But November 4, when all of us were busy watching the elections, Israel broke it, and CNN did a fact check, and it's all over the world, knowing that on November 4 they killed 6 people and they broke the truce. So Hamas was in a way reaction. But really, I want to move this to a different level. I sincerely, and I tell this to John, and you are a professor and you can help us out here, you underestimate the intelligence of the state of Israel when you say Israel really, with all its might and technology and its thinkers and intellectuals that really went into Gaza in order to, like the professor said, get rid of kitchen-made rockets. No, there is a more global and regional players in this mess. Israel would not go to Gaza without the auspices of the USA, without even, I have to say, the approval of some Palestinians and some Arab nations. So there is a larger player. There are things that are happening regionally, and really to narrow the vision of Israel into getting rid of rockets is really trivializing Israel. But one more thing, it's not only Hamas. You have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. You have the armed arm of Fatah lobbing rockets. And I know you don't speak Arabic, but all of their military communique, they are all now fighting Israel in Gaza.
I don't think anyone disputes by any means that there's a number of different factors involved, and there's a number of different players that are there, and there's global factors involved. But I think one of the things in terms of what the flashpoint was, meaning why did the invasion take place when it did, and what was the cause? I think the cause was 90 rockets coming in over that period of time, and that when you have these rockets falling at the levels they were falling in before those few days, that's when it happened. It didn't happen when there were only 5 rockets coming in on a day.
But isn't the bigger picture that the people living in Gaza are sort of trapped from the outside world? So if they're trapped there, I mean, not that their response is right. Nobody would say lobbing rockets is the right way to do it. There has to be a better way to negotiate these people having some sort of economic.
But I think you also have to
stability.
And absolutely right. But as a practical matter, you know, what do the Israelis really want? Obviously, they want these rockets. They want the bombs to stop.
Right.
But you know, Hamas, obviously, you know, are they? What else do they want to achieve? You know, is the stated purpose obviously is to stop the bombing? Would they like to bring Hamas? You know, is this regime change? What would take the place of Hamas? I mean, Hamas is. It has been classified as a terrorist organization, but it's also the government of Gaza. You know, they run hospitals and...
Gandhi, what's his name? Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. Ishaq Shamir, and who ended up becoming the Prime Minister of Israel, was a wanted man by the British. Patrick Henry was considered a terrorist. The point I want to really move John and you and everybody to is that, okay, fine, let's assume whatever, it's the rockets, it's Hamas, it's the way we look or whatever, but is there an end result? Like, okay, how long, John, this is gonna go until there is a big massacre like Qana, where the whole society and the whole global initiative would come out and say, my gosh, this is atrocious, and then Israel stops before maintaining its military and political objective?
I don't think there's any question that Israel would like some type of resolution, and as you get into some of what the broader topics are, it gets more and more difficult to reach certain issues such as rights of return, division of Jerusalem, if that, you know, issues on the West Bank and what happens. But one, I think, the biggest problems on the peace process right now goes back to, again, with whom do you negotiate, and if, in fact, Israel's in a position where it really can't negotiate with Hamas at all. When the other side...
You negotiate with an enemy. You don't negotiate with somebody you love.
Yeah, but
so if the Palestinian will, you cannot crush the Palestinian will. If the Palestinians elected this group, allow it to fail. It was never allowed to fail. Immediately, if you read Vanity Fair, immediately the CIA, with some elements in the Palestinian movement and other regional countries, worked on a coup d'etat to topple Hamas.
Well, finish your point, though.
Yeah, no, but my point is you can't negotiate with sort of the Palestinian people when you've almost got 2 voices. One voice, which is really an Islamic perspective, and I don't mean Islam as a whole, but you're dealing with fundamental Islam, where you're saying, look, you know, Israel does not have a right to exist. It needs to be a Muslim state, part of the Arab world. That you can't negotiate with, and that you can never reach a resolution with. On the other hand, if you're dealing with Abbas and Fatah, where you're trying to reach some type of resolution, you can negotiate with that, but it's difficult to negotiate with that when you're only dealing with really half the issue, because you still have Hamas in Gaza. And I think you have to have some type of resolution with Hamas in Gaza and have sort of a leadership of a Palestinian.
Okay, go ahead.
So, I think in some ways the question becomes, what is the end game in this particular case? If that's the issue, and I think you're right, that it is a divided, and it's very interesting to see how people on the West Bank have viewed what's happening in Gaza. But do you want to see the collapse of Hamas? I mean, this would be utter chaos. It's in nobody's interest to see that happen.
No, and I agree with Jonathan. I want religion out of this equation. This is a matter of self-determination. You have an occupied people and people who want self-determination.
Well, we need about 3.5 hours to talk about this, don't we? We have to take a break. We'll be right back.